Hello everyone. Thanks for joining me again. It's time for a reading update. I wanted to check in, give you an update on what I've been reading, what I've read, currently reading, some things I've tried, and what might be coming up. I've got some notes because I don't have some of these books now because I've returned them to the library. I didn't do a library haul video because I only picked up like 2 books, so I just thought I would catch you up all together. But there is a large pickup coming up at the library. I can see the books that have come in, and you know, that's what happens. You never know when some of these books that you've reserved a long time ago or when they first came into your brain as new releases will come to you. So I think that's going to be this coming weekend. So let's talk about the books. All right. The first book, first, before I get started, I don't want to forget to talk about this little bookcase that's in my office that it just has like a miscellany of books. I've talked about it before, and I don't know why these books live in here. Some of them, most of them are non-fiction, and they come from various classes that I took in college. In the early 2000s, I went to college as an adult, so a lot of these are from my undergrad, and then I took a master's program right after that, so a couple are from that I kept. But two of them here that you can't really see, these 2 are memoirs, and it's really this one, Chanel Miller's Know My Name, that's one of my all-time favorite memoirs, I think from 2021, about her attack when she was on a college campus. Was it Princeton? I'm not sure. Know My Name is her story about starting her case against the guy, the young college student who attacked her. She started off the case as Jane Doe, and then she decided to release her name and make a impact statement at the trial. So this is just so well written and so wonderful, and also just hard to read, and insight into how these legal cases work, which was super eye-opening. Somebody's Daughter is Ashley Ford's story about her relationships with her mom and dad, and her dad was in jail during her upbringing. So I remember less about this book, but I remember it being really good, which is why I kept it. And I just wanted to point out, I saw here, I'm sure many of you Booktube watchers and tubers have had and maybe still have the Elements of Style, which is this book that was written a long time ago, Strunk and White's Elements of Style. I have the 3rd edition here. But this one I got in the early 2000s because it has illustrations in it by one of my favorite artists, really from the New Yorker, named Myra Kalman. And this one has a foreword from E.B. White, which is from 1979, but then it has a foreword from Roger Angell, who is also a New Yorker writer. But I didn't realize until I was rereading this that he is that E.B. White was his stepfather. Anyway, it's got, it's Elements of Style, which is fantastic for writing grammar rules. Like, where do you put commas? How do you use a semicolon? But it's got these wonderful, funky illustrations by Myra Kalman. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that. Okay, so where to start? With a book I don't have, Stay True by Hua Su. I hope I'm pronouncing his first name right. This is a memoir. It just won the Pulitzer Prize as I was reading it, and It's Hua's story about his college years at Berkeley, and about a time where he's at Berkeley. He makes friends. He's Taiwanese, and he makes friends with a Japanese American college student named Ken, somebody who he doesn't really feel like he has much in common with. A lot of people at this time in college are thinking, well, why aren't the Asian kids just friends with each other? But there's a lot of difference, isn't there, between Asian cultures and also just individual backgrounds of human beings. And Ken was way more Americanized than Hua was at the time. So they become really good friends. And then something tragic happens with Ken. You know this from the flap on the book. This is the premise, the setup of the story. So I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone, but Ken dies in a very tragic, random act of violence. It shakes up everybody on campus, everybody in the city of Berkeley. It's a very odd thing to happen at that time, and it changes Hua's life. I mean, the way that he dealt with it was kind of like pre-event and post-event for him. And so he didn't listen to any of the music that they listened to anymore. He didn't watch any of their favorite movies anymore. He didn't really get a lot of solace from his parents, because they're from a time period when they came to the US in the 60s, and their story is about striving and surviving and moving on from lots of tragedy and adversity. As he becomes older, he's now a professor at Bard College, and he's now teaching college kids. And it just became important to him to tell this story about this pivotal moment in his college years, and also just to remember all of that time and appreciate the time that he had with Ken and his other friends. He has journals that he's looking back on for reference, which is really cool. This is also a story that takes place pre-social media, so it was great to just be walking through the 90s and see what we all used to do before we were all in the car together and we're on devices, and they would be listening to the radio, and they were into certain radio stations, and they would be going to the record store. So it's such a gentle read, and yet it's hard to read because of the tragic event that happens. But he writes in such a encompassing, gentle way that I feel like it was the perfect vessel to talk about this really traumatic time in his life. So I really recommend it. The next book I finished is Monsters: A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer. And this is a book that has a fantastic cover, just fantastic. She delves into this struggle over how do we view an artist's art if something is revealed that's bad, troublesome, horrific, criminal about their behavior. And so she starts off the story with this is all just chunked up into different chapters talking about different people or groups of people. And she starts off with Roman Polanski, and the name of the chapter is Child Rapist. She goes into his story and how much she loved Roman Polanski as a director. She then talks about Woody Allen, and if you're my age and in your late 50s and older, I really appreciated and loved Woody Allen films, and I still love his films. But what came out about the fact that he started a relationship with his young stepdaughter, and then things came out recently about some accusations against him from another daughter of a different kind, different kinds of behavior. She talks about this ratio that some people do, like between the acts and versus what we feel about the art. And, do you weigh that? Michael Jackson, is it okay to listen to early Michael Jackson? Is it okay? So it's a book that is a conversation about these topics. She does include some of her own story and her relationships with different artists, and also her thoughts. So lots of questions. I don't feel like she's coming down hard on an answer, but it's a good conversation. I finally read The Trees by Percival Everett. I finally got to it. I remember reading this obviously during Booker Prize time last year, and I never got to it. I was a little scared to read it because I know that it is about some really tough subjects. Lynching, the history of lynching. This book focuses on the South, and but then I heard that the book was funny, and how can the book be funny about such a serious subject? So this is a story that takes place in Money, Mississippi, in an old and poor, mostly white town, and murders start happening. Brutal murders are happening to various people, and at each murder scene, there is also another dead person, and it is always a black man. Different black men though, and it's obvious that they've been dead for a while. So they bring in the Mississippi Bureau of Investigations, and these are two black men coming into this town of mostly white people in the Deep South. And from the get-go though, from when you open up and start to learn about these families before the murders start happening, it is funny. It's satirical. And it's just funny the whole way through as these murders are still happening, and then they start happening around other parts of the United States. And so it's a mystery, and you're turning the pages to find out what the heck is going on. I'm not going to tell you any more about the story, but I can just say it is pretty amazing how you can be reading about these brutal murders and the history of lynching, and you're laughing at different scenes that he's setting up between the people themselves, the families, the detective interactions with the police. He's really, you don't need me to tell you, he's really written a masterpiece. Okay, and the next book I finished is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Hope I'm saying that right. This was my first R.F. Kuang. And I feel like I want to read Babel, but I knew this was coming out, so I reserved it right away. And I also knew that this story was not fantasy, not, speculative fiction, that it was just going to be a straightforward story about a young woman and the publishing world. But it's got this contrivance right from the beginning that could feel like it was too contrived and then the whole thing is unbelievable. But I am going to tell you what, just enough information from the inside flap. So you're going to read this very thing everywhere. But it's about June Hayward, a young author, and she's published one book, but it really didn't do well. She's not using a very good and famous publisher, because she's just starting off. Her somewhat friend from Yale, Athena Liu, has done really well in her book writing. Her books have been really successful. They've all caught on. She's super famous now. She's got the best publisher. And even though they weren't really good friends in college, Athena they both live in the same, I think they live in DC, and she keeps reaching out to her on a regular basis, and they get together for drinks, and it's always Athena reaching out to June. So they end up at a bar, and they go back to Athena's apartment, and something happens really funky, and a complete accident, and Athena dies. You know this from the flap. So the rest of the story is about to launch itself. And what happens is that you find out in that apartment scene that after it's clear Athena has died, that June takes the manuscript that she and Athena were just talking about, that Athena just finished. And Athena does everything manually, so she knows it's just this manuscript. And you find out that she's taken it, and she thinks, I wonder if I could work on it. And I don't know what is inside June's brain, that she thinks she's going to edit it and change a little, and maybe she gets it published. So that really is the launching point of the story, and the rest of the story is about her decisions and everything that tumbles forward after that. This book is also about the publishing world and the craziness of the publishing world, So June's last name is Hayward, and she's trying to get this book published that's largely about Chinese slave labor at a certain point in history. And so the publishers try to spin how they're going to sell a book that's written by a white woman about Chinese slave labor. Maybe they could use her middle name as a last name. Does it sound less white woman? I mean, it's crazy. And then there is a conversation through the interaction of the characters about how the reverse is true. And I really wondered if R.F. Kuang has experienced this herself, where writers who are Asian American or Black writers or Irish writers get pinholed into a certain lane, and their publishers are steering them to write things that they feel are going to be the best type of subject for them to be writing. I've heard Brandon Taylor talk about this on a recent podcast, actually, that just came out today, on Reading the Room with Jaylen. So really interesting. It feels like it could be like a light book. In anybody else's hands, it could be very tropey. It wasn't like that for me, though. I feel like in R.F. Kuang's hands, she's gonna bring on the complexity, and I really feel like she did that here. So just a ripping read. I read it really fast, really enjoyed it. Okay, what am I currently reading? Well, I can tell you what I've tried, first of all, and that is Max Porter's new book called Shy, which is about this is it a teenage boy? This is the story of a few strange hours in the life of a troubled teenage boy, a dangerous young man in the eyes of society, and he's staying at Last Chance boarding school. I started in on this, and I could tell that it was just a different kind of fragmented and very hyper activity and thoughts, and I just feel like I'm not in the right space for this book, even though it's so short, and I haven't read a Max Porter yet. So instead of trying to force it down, I'm just going to return it and maybe come back to it when it's the right time. Sometimes that happens with me. So I can't say anything about this other than it's non-traditional, and from what I hear about Max Porter, I mean, that probably isn't a surprise to anyone. But I would give it a try and see if it's the book for you. Okay, what am I reading? When I was at the library, on the shelf was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I don't know why I picked it up. It just felt like this light read that would be maybe the perfect thing to read right now. And I've been meaning to dip into Taylor Jenkins Reid, but the story of the tennis player didn't seem like it was the one for me, even though I love tennis. There's the other one, Malibu Rising. This one seems like a little different, though, because it's about a young writer given the chance to interview to write a biography of an older Hollywood movie star, somebody who's in their 70s. And yes, she's been married 7 times. So it can be very formulaic, and it is, but the writing is really good so far. I'm not very far in. I am up to husband number 2. So it's early days. I'm enjoying it so far, is all I can say at this point. Okay. Oh, yeah, I don't have it with me, but I am reading a Greene, and I don't have it with me, and I forget what it's called. So I'll leave it in the notes. But I was just in the mood for another Greene. I read a Greene last year for the first time, The End of the Affair, the famous one. And the next one I have, what's it called? It's also a romantic, or it's about an affair anyway. And I was just in the mood for Greene. Backlisted Podcast just released finally a new episode, and it's about Greene. And I'm telling you, his writing is spectacular. It's definitely of its time. I'm assuming this book was written in the 40s or 50s. But his writing, his expressions, he just kept refining them. This is the story that takes place in West Africa, and he's a British policeman who's been assigned to a certain area in West Africa, and his wife is being sent away to South Africa because she can't stay where they are anymore. It's just too difficult for her, and he has an affair. His name is Scobie. That's his last name, and I'm just maybe a quarter into it, so I'm not into the meat of the story yet. But I just really enjoy the writing so much. So I will list the book below, and if you've read Greene, I would love to know what other books you would recommend. And of course, I'm still reading my Trollope, which is Framley Parsonage, and I'm about halfway through, and I'm loving it. What can I say? It's the Barsetshire Chronicles. I want to mention 2 books here before I go. And one of them is Life is Everywhere by Lucy Ives. I got this out of the library. I started it. I'm not going to keep reading it right now, though. It's one of those books where I'll come back to it, or maybe I'll pick it up used later, because it's going to take me a long time to read this. It's written in a very dense way, and the way that it's been described is like those Russian nesting dolls. The back of it says, Manhattan, 2014. It's an unseasonably warm Thursday in November, and Erin Adamo is locked out of her apartment. Her husband has just left her, and meanwhile her keys are in her coat, which she abandoned at her parents' apartment when she exited mid-dinner after her father, once again, lost control. Erin takes refuge in the library of the university where she's a grad student. Blah, blah, blah. But in these first, I don't know, however many pages, none of that has showed up yet. No, it starts off talking about the history of botulism and how that turned into Botox. Yes, and then we're talking about Faith, Dr. Faith Ewer, I guess researching? So I don't know. But I'm intrigued and I want to read it, but I just can't keep reading it right now. So please let me know if you've heard about this book, if it's on your radar, if you're reading it. And then finally, I've got to talk about this discovery. I'm probably the last person on earth to know what this book is about, but I have recently heard about it from Jaylen on Reading the Room podcast and his Booktube channel called The Bar and the Bookcase. A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. This is a book that pretty much puts his MFA masterclass about story writing in a book, but in a really readable way. You really feel like you're a student and George is just talking to you. So this focuses on Russian literature at a certain time, when these Russian authors, who of course are the famous Russian authors, are all writing around the same time, and what their belief system was. Why were they writing the way they were writing? Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Gogol. And he starts off with a short story, Chekhov's short story called In the Cart, a page at a time. And he is feeding you a page at a time. And then we discuss why even this first few paragraphs are written that way. What is the author doing? Why is this different than other Russian literature written at the time? He starts feeding you more pages at a time after that. But this is a book that I will buy a used copy of. Now, it comes out in softback in August, but I think I might pick it up before then, because I would just like to keep dipping in. I would love to know if you read this, because I feel like I'm probably the last person to realize even what it was about. So I am so surprised that little Tuki didn't come in here, because she's in the other room sleeping, and I thought once she heard me and that she knew the doors were open, she'd come in, but she didn't. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with is, speaking of Tuki, I was just thinking today that her name is Suki. It's spelled S-U-K-I. It's short for Sansuki, which was the name she had when we adopted her, which was about a year ago. And I was thinking about all the nicknames that I've now come up with for whatever reason that we call her, or that I call her. Tuki is the name one, Tuk Tuk, Tukster, Tukadoo, Tukarini. And I just recently started calling her My Little Pony in the morning, because she runs around on the first floor between the kitchen and the living room and the foyer, and some of that is the wood floor. And yeah, she sounds like a miniature little pony trotting when she does that. So that's when I call her My Little Pony. And my husband calls her Purball in the morning when they're doing their routine. So I would love to know your pets' names, and what are your nicknames? I bet they're a little different than your pet's actual names. So I would love for you to share. Thanks for sticking in there with me. I'm actually thinking about doing a video where I'm going to talk about some of the reading that I think I might want to do in the summer, whether it's just, books that I have on my radar, maybe a reading project. So I'm thinking about that. I don't really plan, so it's going to be challenging and maybe fun for me to put together my thoughts. So thanks for hanging in there with me and joining me once again. And I hope you have a wonderful reading week.